It is my very great pleasure to introduce, not quite yet, but doubtless very shortly to be, Dr. Lorna Richardson of the UCL Digital Humanities Centre, who is going to be talking about her research on public archaeology and public engagement and sort of crowdsourcing. So, public archaeology in a digital age. Lorna.
Thank you very much. My PhD research at UCL is situated in the Centre for Digital Humanities, but I'm by background an archaeologist, and specifically a community archaeologist. And my interest in the impact of internet technologies comes from working in digital heritage contexts and digital heritage projects over the last 8 years. I came to UCL wanting to kind of address something that I'd researched for my master's thesis. And I think at this point, I'm now 2 weeks before my viva, I realised that I've bitten off rather a lot more than I could chew. So this paper is going to be a whistle-stop tour through some very, very large concepts with some case studies that I've picked out that represent sort of the highlights of the bits of digital humanities and digital literacy and things like that that have impacted on archaeology. As a public archaeology 101, before I go any further, and you're all sitting there wondering if you are wondering what public archaeology is, public archaeology really grew as a discipline from the 1980s onwards in the UK. It has a long history in the literature going back to the 1970s, but as a practice, it's about democratising communication about archaeology, encouraging people to get involved in archaeology, so the practical aspect of community archaeology, which is where people would go out and practice and excavate and do that kind of thing. But at any point where the public and archaeology as a discipline meet is public archaeology, so that can include all kinds of things, which is anything from the Guardian articles that you might read to ethics, to archaeological I don't know, kind of stealing antiquities, that kind of thing. The public archaeology is a very broad term to cover a lot of things. The fundamental point about public archaeology is that it has a democratic element, that it is about introducing people who are not professional archaeologists and getting them involved in understanding and exploring archaeology as a concept. Again, there's a few models for public archaeology which I think is useful to touch on, because this is very much theoretical in terms of trying to understand it from where internet technologies, where the participatory element of what Web 2.0 has allowed us to do, and where public archaeology sits. So there's a few models. The educational approach, which is where archaeologists are responsible for educating the public. So it's a very much what we call a top-down model. The archaeologists are the experts, and the public are happily absorbing the education that they're offered. Something similar is the public relations approach, which again is about archaeology being responsible for talking to members of the public, for making archaeology important politically and economically, is a sort of a process of keeping their jobs and keeping archaeology going as an academic subject. The critical theory area, multivocal approach, is really where my interest in public archaeology and the internet technology side of things meets together. Understanding that there are many different approaches and understandings of archaeology and heritage issues by the public, understanding that archaeologists don't always have it right, we don't always have the right interpretation, we don't always have the right cultural understanding of people whose heritage we may be dealing with on a daily basis. So people like Merriman, Holthoff, Mushenska, Okamura and Matsuda have written about these different models, but sort of as we're getting more and more postmodern, we're becoming more and more interested in multiple perspectives and how we can facilitate a sort of a shared approach, co-curation, all these buzzwords that we're hearing in public engagement. Now, this is a quote, and constantly surprises me that people in archaeology haven't quite got with the programme. I was having a conversation with somebody earlier today on Twitter about they still didn't understand what public archaeology is. But unless archaeologists make their research relevant to the modern world, by any means necessary, and I'm talking specifically now about internet technology, since these are the tools that we're using progressively more and more as technology advances and smartphones become ubiquitous, archaeology as a discipline is going to become very difficult to undertake. And I just show you this because this is one of the reasons why at the moment public archaeology as a practice is very important in the UK, certainly. We've seen an unprecedented amount of budgets lost in the cuts to local authority government. So austerity measures by the coalition government since 2010 have seen something up to a 40 to 50% cut in budgets for historic environment records. Local authority, community archaeology projects have closed down. The oversight from English heritage is changing. English heritage is being let loose and changing into a different model. So this has impacted on Wales and Scotland as well. And museums are closing left, right and centre. Departments are closing at universities or shutting down the number of courses they're teaching. So in terms of archaeology in the future, we're at a very dark point, and the more people understand and are able to value what we do as archaeologists, what we are interested in sharing with the public as archaeologists, hopefully there'll be more political support for funding being poured back into or dribbled back into archaeology, and emphasising that this is an important subject for these reasons, for sharing, for public engagement, for interest, various other things. Not least being that archaeology is also a tool for social change. It's all very well to look at archaeology as a discipline that's about excavating something from point A and putting it into bag B and then trotting off to a museum cupboard. But actually it has a role and a tool as a social changer. Ian Hodder and Minku Kim wrote this in 2008, that this is sort of one of the first pieces of literature about the impact of, or potential impact of archaeology with internet technologies, that it's an important constituent in the fight against marginalisation. So Ian Hodder identified at that point the role of participatory technologies in being able to access or allow access to archaeological information that was previously privileged. There's a lot been said about the impact of the internet. There has been massive improvements in access to cheap hardware, software, mobile phone technologies. The landscape of human interaction, the landscape of how we communicate has changed irrevocably. And we were promised the idea of the stuff that was happening in the Middle East, that revolutions could be tweeted, that Facebook would change the world, that these proprietary social media platforms offered a democratic method of communication that was unprecedented in any other media. And it wasn't broadcast, it was truly a two-way conversation that could have a massive impact. And so archaeology picked up on this, and it became something of a sort of snowball effect that more and more people were interested in using and harnessing these technologies to undertake public archaeology. And I go back to Ian Hodder, I'm afraid, for the second time for another quote. Understanding going back to the multivocality perspective I was talking about earlier for public archaeology. So what I mean by that is making sure that people have the ability to question an archaeological interpretation that's done by professional archaeologists. So the issue of expertise in archaeology, how people can understand what the value is of their opinions and their attitudes towards their own heritage, their own archaeology, and that's especially important with indigenous rights and so on and so forth, but perhaps less so in the UK. But there is an element of this if you're thinking about archaeological projects taking place in deprived areas or areas with a long history of working class activity, so something like a mine or a factory, and what impact that might have. So this takes me to where I started with my PhD and what areas I'm looking at, because I had to define it quite closely, because obviously it is a huge subject, and archaeology is a huge area happening in many different areas, sectors in the UK. So I chose four main areas to look at, which is where public archaeology takes place at the moment. So commercial archaeology, which is archaeology that happens in advance of development. So this is funded by developers originally by John Major's government, 1991. It was called Planning Policy Guidance 16, and that brought in the polluter pays. So if a polluter or a developer is destroying archaeological material, then as part of the planning process, an archaeological intervention has to take place in advance of that development, so an excavation or whatever would happen. And this is an area where some public archaeology takes place nowadays, but actually it's the biggest area where archaeology happens in the UK. So 92% of all archaeology that's done in the UK is development-led. So that's quite an important thing to keep in the back of your mind, but actually this is profit-driven, sort of motivated archaeology, and where does a public interface and a public expectation of access to that material, because these are happening on a huge scale all over the UK every day, these excavations and interventions, but not a lot of that actually gets to the public eye. So, you know, this is stuff that happens behind boarded off development sites, building sites with lots of plant and lots of health and safety issues, but actually that is people's heritage, that's happening in people's towns and villages. How do they access the information that the archaeologists have retrieved? The other area is community archaeology, again something I've worked in, and this is a project, that one up there is the Thames Discovery Programme, which works on the archaeology of the Thames foreshore, which is the bit of the river that you see, the beach essentially when the tide goes out. So there's lots of community archaeology going on in the UK. This is generally led by amateurs, so non-professional archaeologists. There's around 250,000 people who are active in community archaeology in the UK. It tends to be a mixture of local societies and HLF projects, HLF funded projects. And the demographic is different, so it's a lot older, it's a lot more technologically challenged, probably not the subtlest term I could have used, but technologically difficult to understand people. But they produce an enormous amount of archaeological information. These people are very active, they're politically very supportive of archaeology, so it's a key area for public archaeology. The other area here, the Norfolk Heritage Explorer website, is just another example. This is historic environment records. So local authority archaeology, as part of the planning process in the UK, there's an obligation, not technically legally obligated, which is why they're allowed to close them down all the time, but they maintain the historic environment record, they undertake planning, application, reviews in advance of development work, and some still do manage community archaeology projects. So this is in your local authority. London has one, county councils will have them, some district councils have them. And the final one at the bottom is universities. There's a number of universities in the UK that undertake public archaeology projects, UCL being quite a strong example of this. And again, you know, this is an opportunity for what would normally be a dig that would happen over 5 or 6 weeks of the summer. Nobody really knows what goes on behind the scenes. So how internet technologies could enable some kind of publicity, some information being shared. One of the things that I undertook each year as part of my PhD research was looking at the numbers of public archaeology, digital public archaeology projects that were happening. And this is a screenshot of the last one I believe I did, which was 2012-13. So you can see that out of some 6,000 or 7,000 projects in those 4 examples that I showed you in the previous, there's actually a very, very small number of digital projects. So the website thing is good, you know, there's a good strong showing of archaeological organisations, community groups and so on having websites, but actually the take-up of blogging, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube and so on is quite small. But between 2010 when I started and 2013 when I finished, there was over a 200% growth in the adoption of these technologies, and some of these projects are incredibly professionally done. They have specific members of staff now to do public engagement digitally. So it's a growth area, it really is a growth area. Approaching this broad, huge subject and approaching how to understand situating my research questions in a very diverse archaeological environment and with very, very diverse members of staff, many of whom weren't digitally engaged in any way, shape or form whatsoever and didn't want to know anything about it. I decided to use two sort of strange, slightly weird approaches to data collection, which I just want to briefly touch on because I think these have potential for further research applications in heritage. One is an ethnographic approach. Now, ethnography is something that was based or was born in advertising and marketing, and it's ethnographic research online, and it was done sort of looking at reactions to branding, advertising branding, and discussions people were having on forums and things like that. But developing that as an approach in terms of digital public archaeology, so using ethnography as a way of observing people's interactions. What I was interested in is how are people using these technologies in archaeology? And so as an ethnographic approach would be an ethnographic study of that online. And I started by introducing what I was doing on my blog, tweeting it and Facebooking it, and then started observing conversations people were having, interactions people were having, the type of comments that were being left on blogs, the type of information that was shared, the number of retweets that people had, and so on and so forth. So trying to understand this as a bit of a peeping Tom on the world of digital archaeology, so looking at how community groups and community conversations and activism was taking place in archaeology through ethnography. From a theoretical perspective, it was very, very difficult to come up with something that would cover the sort of pioneering area, because there hasn't really been a lot of work done in the area of digital public archaeology, none in the UK. So I took the grounded theory approach and decided that the best way to understand what was going on would be to collect lots of data and then look at how that data worked in terms of using coding qualitative information and studying it from that angle. And just a little bit about grounded theory. I think this has a lot of legs for digital work. So you collect data, you systematically code and categorise it, and then you spit it out at the end, and eventually you'll come up with some kind of theory. I would not feel strongly that I have created theory in my thesis, but it's certainly pointing me in directions that I hadn't expected. But I think the churning development of public archaeology and digital stuff is such that you can't clump it into it doesn't fit into a nice theoretical area. So it's quite difficult and challenging. Just next, want to just quickly go over some of the areas of the subjects and themes that I researched, and there's tons of them, and so I'm trying to categorise them. One is looking at the concept of archaeological communities, so communities of practice, and how communities are using digital technologies, not simply for public engagement, but for engagement within the discipline. To go to the end of my paper, before I get to the end of my paper, I don't think that participatory technologies have had the expected impact on participation with members of the public and public engagement. That's the conclusion I came to. But I think the biggest impact of participatory technologies has been on the discipline itself and been on communication within the discipline. And this is something that comes through very, very strongly in all of my data collection. One area that I concentrated on, probably too much, was Twitter. And hopefully everybody knows what Twitter is. It's a very succinct way of talking to people, communicating links, ideas, images and so on. And I did an annual survey on the use of Twitter, how archaeologists were using it, and looked at this from the perspective of social capital, and looking at how people were taking advantage of the fact that something as simple as a tweet doesn't actually include any of your disciplinary affiliations, any of your institutional capital, any of your personal knowledge or capital. It's purely about what you say. So in terms of sharing archaeology, the veracity of the information that you're sharing on Twitter doesn't reflect, a biography that comes from anything more than 160 characters. So in terms of looking at it as a sort of community thing, I expected there to be more levelling off and for this to demonstrate something that would be about sharing information on a completely equitable level. So by involving yourself in Twitter, by talking about archaeology, by discussing stuff, it was an all-comers, a welcome kind of thing. Which it is, which my data shows, that it's not about who you are, it's about how long you've been and how trustworthy your information is. So you can be a student, and there are students who tweet and who have lots and lots of followers and share an enormous amount of information. And there are professors from august institutions across the UK and beyond who are on Twitter and don't have as many followers and are not as engaged. So it does seem to sort of level off things, and it's a very interesting way of looking at community creation. I could warble on about it for hours, but I won't. Moving on with the theme of community and understanding communities of practice, part of my practice thesis cycle that I went through was creation of the Day of Archaeology. The Day of Archaeology project is running again this year for the final time on the 11th of July. It's a community blogging project, and the idea was in the beginning that the Day of Archaeology would be a window onto the world of archaeology. So archaeologists would be invited to participate by blogging about their day, so writing about what they did, whether that was writing papers, filling filing cabinets, or actually Indiana Jones full-on archaeology. And the idea was that it would engage the public, people would come along, they would find out what goes on behind the scenes and discuss the information that they found, and it would be a point of public archaeology, a point of public engagement even. My results from my data research on the impact of the Day of Archaeology, and this is from 3 years worth of archaeology, I'll just make sure I haven't put it on the next slide, has shown that this again is more about communities of practice, and the types of comments that have been left on the blog, the types of connections that are made, the discussions that are had, are actually between archaeologists or museum workers or curators and so on and so forth, rather than it having an impact on the public. So it's kind of become a project that is a historiography of archaeology, snapshots of the history of archaeology as it happened in the late 2000 teens, whatever you call them, rather than a point of public engagement. But actually the impact it's had as a community event, as a communities of practice event, is huge, and new collaborations have been set up, people are able to communicate and find new collaborators or discuss writing papers with people and so on. This is an interesting visualisation of the Day of Archaeology through Twitter last year. Part of the Day of Archaeology last year was something called Archive Bingo, and the London Archaeological Archive and Research Centre, which is short to LARC, ran an Archive Bingo session through Twitter, but uploading the information to the blog. So it was a twofold process. But the idea was that they would get members of the public to tweet catalogue numbers from the archive, they would run and get the box out, and then they would take a photograph of what was inside and upload the story to the blog. So a kind of exercise in publicising the material that was found in their archives, which is, never sees light of day. Fantastic, we all thought this would be, this is quite exciting. And this is a visualisation, I laugh, it's ironic, a visualisation of who spoke to who. So all the tweets that were happening, flying around on the day, are actually not one person on this is a member of the public. Every single person on this is either an academic, a curator, an archaeologist, a volunteer in archaeology who's already been involved in it for long enough. They're not new to the project. They're not new to the sector. So again, it's a demonstration of community of practice and of encouraging debate and conversation and new connections. But in terms of public engagement, it's a complete fail. It will stay online, it will be there forever, and it is a resource, an archive of information should people choose to access it in the future. And obviously the project was not funded, and the staff members ran it as a collective, and blah blah blah. Time takes up time. Excuses. But it's interesting to see that the potential for large-scale community blogging or large-scale community social media use didn't actually work in this instance. So I'm putting this down as a case study and glossing over it. Where the community of practice sort of theme that ran through my research really did work was looking at archaeological activism. So looking at the impact of digital technologies for news sharing at a rate of knots, and for bypassing traditional media, bypassing access to your local MP and things like that, and actually causing trouble and getting attention paid. There's been a number of issues that are sort of shifting through social media on various, as HERs are closing, as museums are closing. People are picking up on this, that this is a way of garnering people's attention and making sure that they come together on these issues and then disperse. So it's very much about bringing people together and dispersing. So it's not like organising a demonstration, it's not like organising protests and so on. And this is just one example from Northern Ireland. Cherry Mount Crannog. A Crannog site is, I don't know if you know, it's a waterlogged site that they were built as sort of islands in lakes and rivers, certainly in Scotland and Northern Ireland. And they're very rare and very well preserved if they are found waterlogged. And there was a road going in, a massive main road going in this area. It was on the Ordnance Survey maps, and it had been since the 1800s, so there was absolutely no excuse for them to put this road through this fantastic site. The preservation levels were amazing. And they had a tiny amount of time to excavate it. The archaeologists who were working on the site, so this is part of developer-funded archaeology, the archaeologists that were working on the site were told they had to be off-site very quickly, and they knew that there was an enormous amount of archaeology still left in the ground that justified good excavation. They went home and they blogged about it. And from this blog spiralled a Twitter account, a Facebook group, and from those three things, a huge focus was drawn onto this site and to what was happening. And eventually, the public got involved in it, so this is really sort of stepping outside, but originally it was archaeologists that managed it. The public got involved in it, a huge stink was caused, and the local MP had to come down, and the Minister for Northern Ireland for the Environment was involved, the Archaeological Institute for Ireland was involved, the British Institute for Archaeologists were involved, Council for British Archaeology, every single big name you could think of were complaining to the Irish government saying this shouldn't happen. And the result was this digital media snowball created by somebody going home one night after work and going, I've had enough of this is disgusting, I'm going to blog about it, actually eventually meant that the site was fully excavated. The Minister for the Environment for Northern Ireland halted the road's construction. There was a series of public engagement exercises and an exhibition at the local museum. So from something that would have been done, bish, bash, boxed, gone, it actually became a huge event. So you can see that there are potential applications for bringing communities together through digital technologies that perhaps didn't exist before. Another area, moving on swiftly because I can go on about that all day, another area I've looked at is how participatory technologies challenge the concept of archaeological expertise. So how professional archaeologists are able to maintain their professional status and standing and the information quality that they're sharing if there is an open free-for-all through participatory technologies, through online forums, through websites, through everything. And just a couple of case studies that I've used. The megalithic portal is an interesting, slightly old-fashioned looking website, but actually an incredible amount of information is held in that. Both proper, as I would say, as an archaeologist, a professional archaeologist, professionally produced archaeological information, and it has areas in those forums that allow earth mysteries. Stonehenge was created by aliens, that kind of ilk. And balancing out how, pyramids and blah, blah, blah. But balancing out the two things and how, going back to the concept of multivocality, how relevant and interesting this is to archaeologists is debatable, but actually this is something that people want to discuss in an archaeological environment. They want to feel that they're engaged with it, they're allowed to be engaged with it. So looking at the megalithic portal as a sort of special community that holds both archaeological information and sort of left field stuff. But actually, does it matter, and what's the difference? So that's an interesting debate. Another thing is looking, as you can see, the gay caveman story, which is a bit old now, but there have been many strange newspaper stories that have been shared through social media, and the interesting impact of sort of Chinese whispers on these media as they go along. So a burial was found in Czech Republic. It was a burial that was a male skeleton with possibly female cultural objects. And the Telegraph and the Daily Mail both leapt on this, and he was a gay caveman. Wonderful, wonderful stories. And it kept going, and it was retweeted and it was re-Facebooked, and the addition of these social media seemed to keep what would essentially be tomorrow's chip wrappers going endlessly, and there are still people tweeting as gay cavemen. This story has not left the popular imagination. So the long tail effect of poor archaeological information, of the sort of lack of archaeological expertise, has a really, really long effect, and it's something that is a kind of a warning to archaeologists. Recently there was an excavation that took place last year in Suffolk at Leiston Abbey. I don't know if anybody's seen it, it's been in the newspapers recently and it's been online recently, where they found a dog. It was a medieval dog, and the medieval dog suddenly became Black Shuck, who's a phantom devil dog that inhabits parts of East Anglia. So these crazy stories are propagated by participatory technologies, and people still keep going to, until today. It's still going and going, and it will keep going and going. So I looked at how archaeologists, or how archaeological organisations specifically, addressed the issue of how does participation, how does opening these chinks in your armour as archaeologists and sort of looking at multivocality and public engagement, how does this change your attitudes to information that you share on these platforms? Can everybody see that okay? But I think what it boils down to is actually archaeological organisations are very well buttressed against any information being shared in a bad way that could be harmful to them, or any non-archaeological, non-professional involvement. That they're very, very professional in their writing style, they're very, very professional in their editing, as you'd expect, that it's embedded, so understanding how to maintain your archaeological authority and maintaining your expertise and your public demonstration, your sort of performance of expertise, is first and foremost in their use of archaeological platforms or archaeological social media platforms. To the point where one organisation of 10 that I interviewed said that if they had accidentally put archaeological information that was incorrect online, they would feel they'd have to fall on their sword and resign. So this is a quite sort of strong and tight holding on of archaeological expertise and professionalism, and performing that archaeological expertise and professionalism even in areas of the web that we would expect there to be able to be a bit more sharing and a bit more engagement and discussion. So the multivocality side of things, the sort of the public engagement and discussion and debate that these platforms offer, are actually held very tightly, and the impact is very minimal. I just have to, because there's quite a lot to do with this one, but this is very important, something that has not been considered at all really by archaeologists or archaeological organisations, is the issue of information literacy. There is a lot of digital inequalities inherent in the use of internet technologies. And certainly if you're looking at things like using mobile phone apps for archaeological sites, or stuff where you have to go outside and do stuff. Generally archaeological sites in the UK tend to be in the country, outside of 3G networks, that kind of thing. But there's also the issue of the demographic of archaeology tends to be older, so there tends to be less confidence with the use of digital technologies. A lot of archaeological organisations don't value these methods of communication. They don't value public engagement, digital or not. So there's a lot of barriers. There's a whole chapter of barriers in archaeology. But information literacy is really quite important. And from a digital humanities perspective, this is sort of key to the central issue of expertise in understanding and managing authority. There's the amount of complexity of information online, so the amount of archaeological information online and sort of specialisms as such, that making judgments about truth claims are really difficult. So talking about anonymity and the pedigree problem, that understanding whether the website that you're looking at actually contains proper archaeological information from a proper archaeologist, or is it actually somebody who believes that the pyramids were created by giant aliens. Okay, I'm exaggerating slightly, but the lack of understanding of pedigree inherent in the internet is just there, that you do have to do some Googling to find out who puts these sites up. The absence of gatekeepers. So you're not in a position using participatory media to have an editor. There's no academic library advisor pointing in the right direction with the right literature. There's no textbook. There's no peer review of any of the information, or some of the information that goes online. So the truth of this information, again, is under question, and it takes some information literacy to be able to unpick what is authoritative and what is not. Pseudo-science and propaganda speaks for itself. As I say, giant aliens. Image manipulation techniques, images can be manipulated. Certainly if you look at stuff, I don't think it's been manipulated specifically, but if anybody is interested in this kind of thing, a good example is the Bosnian pyramids. There is a man, Osmanagic, who works in Bosnia and believes that there are a series of pyramids that were constructed in the Neolithic, I believe. But again, a site of enormous discussion about what is archaeological expertise and what is archaeological authority. So one to go away and have a good ponder on. Echo chambers being another thing. If you're interested in a particular thing, then you're probably unlikely to step too far outside of your disciplinary interest. And algorithms tend to personalise web services, so your jumps into new information are unlikely to be too big. And skittering and bouncing is something else that's quite important for understanding how people are using the information that we've put online as archaeologists. So information consumption doesn't necessarily reflect critical, deep source reading. So you're not looking at information for too long if you're using the internet for information searching. That's something that's well researched. Information seekers tend to bounce through web pages supported by search engines and skitter across these pages viewing information. I mean, if anybody has a Google Analytics account on any kind of, you can see how quickly people move through your websites. So according to authors Miller and Bartlett, who this is adapted from, an online article, so an online academic article, is viewed for around 5 minutes, and summaries are read much more than the full content. So even by putting information online, even by making everything as possibly engageable with, you're still looking at 1, digital inequalities, and 2, the issue of information literacy. So these will impact how people absorb or engage with your information. Of course, one of the biggest problems, and I'm now moving on to the last bit, you'll be glad to hear, and I will just briefly mention some of the issues, the barriers to public engagement with archaeology online. The biggest one is funding. In the UK, We have very, very little organisations that have, very, very few organisations that have access to funding that is dedicated specifically for digital projects. Now, that may or may not be a problem, but if you're working in an area where you don't have access to professionals in your organisation who know what they're doing, and you have people setting up accounts and trying to create blogs and so on and so forth, because the use of many of these platforms is free, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not time, they don't have a time impact, and time is money, and obviously you've got to troubleshoot these projects, you've got to create them, have a strategy, ideally have a strategy for them. So this has a big impact. And as you can see from this, most organisations don't have a budget for digital projects. So any kind of public engagement, funded public engagement within organisations, tends to be around £1,000 to £3,000, and of that, very, very few are actually able to fund specific public archaeology digital projects, which means that the types of projects and the ambition of these projects is limited. So the opportunities for actual genuine discussion and broadcast and genuine public engagement, so genuinely involving people in archaeology through these technologies, is very limited, and it has a knock-on effect. One of my biggest beefs with archaeology, and this is something I hope to develop postdoctorally, is the fact that very few organisations, and I think looking at this pie chart, 8 organisations reported to me that they had done any audience research. Now, if you do look at the previous one, some of these organisations have over £10,000 worth of budget. Shocking. But none of those did any audience research. So money is being spent, staff time is being spent on digital projects without any discernible impact, without any discernible understanding of who the audience could be, without any strategy or understanding of these things. Apps are being created, websites being created without the grounding which should be who's going to use this information, how they're going to use this information, what needs do they have, what do they want from their archaeology. Another bugbear of mine is the fact that a lot of these participatory projects, and this is especially some of the crowdsourced projects, aren't so bad now, but a few years ago were terrible. Share your photos with us, share your comments with us, fine. But actually, could we put some parameters around that and tell us what you expect? And very, very few archaeological organisations were able to provide user guidelines. So we are essentially acting as ventriloquists in that we are asking for participation, but we don't really want it. We're saying all the correct words, but actually, we're not going to tell you what we want contributed. We're not going to tell you how we want you to share your information. There's my last slide. How can we reduce barriers to participation in public archaeology online? Now, some of this is coming out of the surveys that I've done and the interviews that I've done, and I'll just briefly wrap this up by saying that to effectively engage the public in archaeology and to actually truly think about this from a sort of multivocal and equal, equitable perspective, we need more time for audience research, we need better financial resources and better targeted resources. We need to change public engagement, or the attitude for towards public engagement. Until there's better access to broadband or to mobile signals, a lot of the UK and a lot of the archaeological sites in the UK will be difficult to find. So those archaeology organisations that have created apps for sites without 3G signals should have done some audience research. Better training for staff, so actually understanding how you use these things, what your organisational policy should be, how to manage things that happen online, like trolling or the Great Owl incident yesterday by the Labour Party. But how do you manage when things go bad online? A lot of organisations don't know this, so they're terrified of using these kind of technologies to talk to the public in case something bad happens. And better publicity and marketing strategies. A lot of organisations are spending a great deal of time and effort on creating websites and creating Twitter platforms, Twitter discussions, but actually nobody knows about them because they're not publicised at all. And I say this almost every time I give a paper, but there should be a national focus for archaeology online, similar to Culture 24 if you're familiar with something. So a kind of portal, a central point at which all of these organisations can come together that are using digital technologies and share their information, so people can have a one-stop shop for this information. I hope I've gone on long enough. That's me. This is my email address, and find me on Twitter. If anybody's got any longer things they want to discuss, please get in touch.
Get on to questions, yes.
There are two problems that you didn't flag up, but I'm interested to agree with the ones you flagged up about the online thing with archaeology. One is what I call virtual reality versus actual reality. And to my mind, you know, I've Googled things like Ostia Antiqua online, and I've been to Ostia, and one is a very pale reflection, a two-dimensional reflection of the 3D reality. And the danger is a lot of archaeologists will just see that's a poor relation and sort of use online as a prop. They won't go to these places, they'll just go online, which to my mind is very, very poor quality for them. They should get off the backsides and actually go to these sites. And you get online, you tend to sort of get lazy with that. And the other thing is the geek syndrome. You know, people tend to get geeky. You know, I'm an archaeologist, and then all the knowledge is comes off the computer. And kind of like, you know, people. I started studying archaeology in the 80s when you actually. I mean, computers filled a room, so they weren't practical, but it was just nice to actually do the real archaeology. So the only thing that concerns me is something different from you. It's not the funding, but it's that the internet could take over, and then everyone's doing everything virtually and not doing it in practice.
I don't think that's going to happen, just purely on the
no, but there seems to be
planning model, but yeah.
You can see, not maybe with everyone, but I'm exaggerating to make a point, but there could be a danger that a lot of people will be so-called experts, but they're actually just looking at anything off Google or something.
I just don't see that happening, because I think there is always going to be people that want to work in the field, and there'll always be people that are interested in doing it digitally. And I mean, those are the more geeky, nerdy. Yeah. We want to stay in front of our computer types, fair enough. But I think there'll always be a place for digging stuff up. I think that's the magic. That's the hook, isn't it? That why people get involved in it in the first place is the treasure, the discovery, the mystery.
I'm just wondering, because I belong to the generation that actually went digging before computers were widespread, that maybe this generation growing up now, with the digital technology world surrounding everything, tweeting and all this stuff, that they're in danger of just going online and not actually doing the real stuff.
I think most people would probably want to do the real stuff before they'd go online. Yeah, I just don't. I think most undergraduates are probably more interested in getting muddy than tweeting about it.
I rest my case.
Yeah.
It's very interesting, but I think many of the things you said could apply to other subjects besides archaeology, history, cures for cancer, all sorts of things where there is a professional core and then lots of people creating myths outside. And you gave a great part of your talk was devoted to that. And you use this word multivocal quite a lot. The solution that you didn't mention that occurred to me is real archaeology, as it were, has to build up a reputation which can stand against the myth makers. And one way of doing that is not by tweeting everything around, but by making it available to be read free online by open access. I mean, I'm chairman of an open access publishing company, and we can talk about that. We have a book coming out later this summer exactly on what you're talking about. But the point would be, how can some member of the public, as it were, get to know about some subject that interests him if he has to pay £1,000 for a subscription to some journal, or if he has to go to London to join the British Museum to get some book that costs £100? There's no puzzle about this. That the real stuff, a PhD monograph, is now produced in 300 copies and sells at about £100. So why, is anybody surprised that it makes no impact on the general public? So that would be the first thing, that some of the money that you're spending on encouraging tweets and audience research should just be built into what archaeology is. That you do the digging and then you publish it online at a professional standard.
The two are not separate things. I think
Right.
one comes from the other, and I've written about open access impact in public archaeology thesis.
Good, because that seems to me. But I wanted actually to make another point, because the nexus which you described with the market and with the funding, that and this word multivocal. I mean, is there not a risk here that you just give the punters what they want to hear? I mean, who in the end tells the stories? Archaeology doesn't speak for itself, the objects don't speak for themselves. Someone has to interpret them and fit them into some general... you took extreme examples of the little man from Mars building the pyramids, but there are a lot of less extreme, very political. I was in Wales last year, there are people who are getting funding to describe the castles of Wales as some, the English came in and destroyed us and so on, and then there are other people who have different stories. So there has to be some authority about who tells the stories and who doesn't. What is the level of myth that is tolerable?
I guess that depends on your theoretical perspective on approaches to expertise in archaeology. I mean, there are some people, I would include myself, who believes that anybody can do archaeology and anybody can create archaeological interpretations and narratives that are relevant to themselves culturally. It depends who you are, whether
you're very postmodern. You're sort of you've cut off the branch on which you're sitting, because unless you're claiming that you know some things or have more training or something.
I think there is a role for archaeological expertise, but I don't see that there has to be. It's not mutually exclusive. I don't think that I think it's opening opportunity up for people to interpret their own heritage and understand their own information and data and have access to that. And I think these things are all intertwined.
I think on the first point about public access, open access. I mean, I'm a huge supporter of open access publication, but in this case, for the public engagement aspect, open access is only one part of the answer. Even with open access, a PhD thesis monograph is no use to the vast majority of the public. One, because I'll never hear about it, and the other, because it's written as a PhD thesis. They won't understand a word and they won't be interested. Public engagement is much more about engaging with people, and primarily through digital media, which is also open access, in a way that's specifically targeted at the general public. I think that's much more important than whether it's free or not.
Yeah, it's about creating archaeological narratives that are or supporting people to create their own archaeological narratives. And it isn't necessarily allowing them access to complex and very detailed bodies of data that they may not have any clue about interpreting.
Patronising. So we will have one set of publications for the public, but the public are not allowed to see the primary material or the primary.
Why do you have to have either or? You can have both.
Well, not if it's very expensive.
But if it's open access model, then
that's
fine.
And also I think that the nature of the sort of trend, the kind of models of social media you've been discussing actually require us to rethink what is meant by publication in archaeology. And it's a very, and I think, that's, it doesn't have to be exclusive. The professional expert monographs are still going to be there, but there are new models of publication that are nothing to do with those that are emerging as a result of these technologies. And I think that's
as higher education institutions are moving towards, requiring their staff to publish, like we have to at UCL, publish in open access, or allow our publications to become open access. It's going to change the landscape completely.
Just staying with the public archaeology and how you engage the public with social media. I was, sorry, amused is not quite the right word, but empathised with your day of archaeology, where it came up that, in effect, you're talking to other archaeologists and other professionals. I ran a workshop here last year on social media for museums, and that was the consensus there, that with all the museums, for all their outreach through Twitter and their blogs, they're talking to each other. You tend to be talking to your audience of people that you know within your academic and professional community with there as well. And the other thing that struck me was your slide on the user studies, which of course is an absolute prerequisite. The user studies, the user engagement studies should be done before the web development, before the app development. But what struck me is that the worst offenders were the ones that actually had the funding. So the model that seemed to come out of that, to me, was actually, it's a tick box. Please give me money to do this and I will make a website. Please give me money, I'll make an app. Right? So there isn't the money in there or the incentive actually to do the user studies, but it's useless without the user studies being done beforehand. You need to know who your audience is, how to engage with your audience, and what your audience wants as well. Yeah, tell them and shout it loudly, right? Talk to people online who are not immediate members of your academic or community or peers, and also get the groundwork done if you're going to create something. It's simple marketing, and I think the only place we can get away with not doing that is in the academy, unfortunately, because outside of the academy, you would not survive if you did not do your market research and your user studies beforehand.
It's interesting, the HLF now, last year they released some digital guidelines for, they have to, every single HLF funded project now has to have a digital element to it, but they've actually put it very specifically in their guidelines about making sure that you match your audience to your digital output, which is quite, I'm shocked. I was shocked when I read it, happily shocked, but yeah, finally.
It's changed, it is developed in the